all the pipes. What we do is we open the hatch to it and set a heater in front of it that's blowing heat into it. So the water is balmy.
Well, welcome in, everyone, to our second session of, if you will it, a brief history of Zionism. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of session last week, the key word in that title is brief. I've done my best, as is the case with many of us rabbis, to overplan. And so I packed in a lot into this session as I did last week, but I'm hoping to have some opportunities for conversation and discussion. Just so you're aware, we will be recording this session so that folks who weren't able to tune in might be able to watch the session, and it'll be posted to our YouTube page. So without further ado, let me admit all of those who are joining us, as I'm managing many different aspects over here. I got the slideshow, I got the Zoom screen, but honestly, it's hearkening back to earlier times when I did a lot of teaching over this platform. So that I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll dive in.
What's going on with your camera? Because you're jumping up and down in the camera for me.
Oh, it might be, I have it on like a pillow. So I'll try to be
okay.
as careful and steady as possible. I don't want to give anyone vertigo. But we're back again, if you will it, a brief history of Zionism. So last week, we talked about some of these key terms. And for those who joined us, you might have had flashbacks to your European history courses, which is really often the case when we're talking about the origins of Zionism, or at least this brief intro to Zionism. You got to start somewhere when we're talking about the history. And I decided to start specifically with the French Revolution and the onset of kind of this modern world that we know a little bit about being products of it. So the key terms we talked about were emancipation, meaning political rights and citizenships, and citizenship primarily for Jews living in the Western sphere, Central and Western sphere of Europe. We talked about the Enlightenment, this philosophical, scientific, and political movement that emphasized individual autonomy, as well as taking certain powers away from the state when it comes to determining or having any say over a person's creed or religious beliefs. So the separation of church and state, which we know very well, most of us being products of our American environment. We also talked about nationalism, the idea of nations as being actually distinctive, although at times encompassing religious identity, and about the core elements of nationalism being language and land. And for some, there is a religious element of it, but that whole question of what comprises a nation, meaning is it just a language, is it just a territory, or is it like all of that being tied to this like mythic origin that we see in notions of German nationality, English nationality. We began talking about kind of the limitations of those frameworks for Jews. And then we ended by talking about how it was a little bit different in the Eastern European sphere, and talked a little bit about what's called the Pale of Settlement, this area that Jews were I don't want to say that were restricted to living within, and how the political opportunities for them were a little bit different than the political opportunities in Central and Western Europe. So today, key terms we're going to be talking about. Number one, naturally, is going to be anti-Semitism. Very, very important anytime you talk about the history of Zionism. And then we're going to be dipping into some of the many flavors of Zionism. And this will be part one. Part two will be next week. I hope I don't get sued by Baskin-Robbins for putting this on there. But if you'll notice the Baskin-Robbins logo, they're very famous for their 31 flavors of ice cream. And although there aren't quite 31, we have many different flavors of Zionism that begin popping up, primarily over the course of the 19th century, over the course of the 1800s. And that lead into what we're really going to focus on today, which is the turn of the 20th century. So before we begin, are there any questions or things that people have been wondering since our last session together? Okay, and for those of you who weren't able to join, I apologize that I haven't been able to send out the video recording of the first session, but I will be sending that out along with a PDF version of the slides that I used. So you'll be able to catch up, and hopefully we'll have that by the end of the week. But things at Temple, we are adjusting and adapting as we always do. And so there's been a lot going on with that this week. But let's go ahead and dive in today. So our first stop in our second session is anti-Semitism. I would not expect any of you to know who this portrait of this man with a wonderful mustache. But this is, in fact, Tsar Alexander II. Oh, I put it right there. I apologize. So I would expect for you to know. Tsar Alexander II, who comes into power, I believe, in 1855, is seen as kind of this great reformer. And of course, the name Tsar indicates they actually used the term Emperor of the Russian Empire at the time. And Tsar Alexander II comes in as a reformer. He wants to change the landscape for the Russian Empire, and specifically for different groups of people that were seen as minorities or as disenfranchised, whatever terms we want to use. And so in 1861, this is a huge thing just in terms of larger European history, world history. He liberates the serfs, those who were kind of destined to be indentured laborers to the Russian aristocracy. That's a huge deal. Now, it's important to recognize this is happening a little bit later than a lot of the deconstruction of aristocratic systems that are happening in Western Europe. But of course, if we know 1861, very similar to our Civil War, this is kind of part of this trend that is happening around the world. And I don't know if folks ever watched The Great, the Hulu series, talking about Catherine the Great, but whenever I hear about liberating the serfs, that's what I think. So by the laws of March 16th, 1869 and 1859 and 1861, he begins to integrate Jewish scholars, university graduates, wholesale merchants, manufacturers, and artisans, integrating them into Russia proper, allowing them to leave the Pale and actually integrate themselves into larger Russian society, whether that's in the world of artisans and merchants and commerce, or in the scholarly world of the universities and academia. Now, this is something that, as we talked about last week, was happening in other European countries earlier, but this begins happening, and this is, again, something that the Jews are very excited to, for the most part, take advantage of getting what we would refer to as a secular education. Instead of going to yeshiva or the cheder to study Jewish religious texts, they're able to go to these great schools in Russia to engage with the larger philosophy and ideas and criticism that's happening as part of the development in the mid-19th century. But as we saw last week, and we see that as this is happening in Western Europe, this is, has been happening for a long time. We see a lot of Jews or people we might say that come from Jewish ancestry becoming integrated into the high culture of what's happening in Europe. And all of this is well and good. The Jews, it's only a half measure in a lot of ways, but it seems like the beginning of something greater and the beginning of what we were seeing in Western Europe, where instead of being confined to specific territories governed by the rabbinic legal authorities, the Jews are able to integrate into larger society. But all of that ends unceremoniously, or ceremoniously, really unceremoniously, with the assassination of Alexander II in 1881, which is pretty much leads to chaos. And specifically a lot of uprisings and a lot of violence across the Russian Empire. And much of that violence actually being directed against Jews. And so in response, you have a series of pogroms. Folks aren't familiar with that term. It is, I believe it's originally a Russian term that means riot, but usually is used to refer to populist or popular uprisings that lead to violence against Jews or the destruction of Jewish property and homes. And so we have here a depiction from a Spanish lithographer, I'm not sure if I get the right term for what kind of art that is. I'll leave that to you art history experts to correct me on. Depicting what's happening in 1881 and over the course of 1881, 1882, which is a series of pogroms, a lot of these uprisings that lead to violence against Jews. Basically, by virtue of certain press releases and word of mouth, Jews are blamed for the assassination of Tsar Alexander, even though it's well documented that there was no involvement by the Jewish community in that assassination. And here we have an example from the Southern Russian Workers Union, one of the many different laborers unions that are springing up, that says, brother workers, you are beating the Jews, but indiscriminately. One should not beat the Jew because he's a Jew and praise to God in his own way. Indeed, God is one and same to all. Rather, one should beat him because he is robbing the people. He is sucking the blood of the working man. Of course, kind of laying behind all of this is the beginnings of socialist movements, communist movements that seek to liberate workers that have been oppressed and exploited over the course of time. And something that is important to recognize, and we'll actually talk about next week, is that Jews were very much involved in a lot of these socialist and communist movements. Specifically, one of the flavors of Zionism we're going to be talking about is labor Zionism or social Zionism. It was very much guided by socialist ideology. But this is a huge, there's no other way to put it. This is a huge slap in the face to a lot of the Jews that became highly educated, that saw the opportunity to be a part of this larger Russian kind of renaissance that is happening. And as a result, as Arthur Hertzberg writes, after 1881, very few could make themselves believe that the Russian state was anything else than the unequivocal and permanent enemy of the Jew. Now, Alexander II was seen largely as a friend to the Jews, but of course, when we're talking about a large empire, you have a lot of different factions that kind of took power into their own hands, whether that was mobs from various villages or towns to actual pieces of the army that enacted a lot of violence against Jews. And 1881 is a really important date because between 1881 and generally around 1910, and largely as a result of things like this and later pogroms that happen specifically in 1904, 1905, you begin to have the largest immigration of Eastern European Jews to one United States of America. And I think many of us can connect with that history. Many of our ancestors, including my own, all right, I say ancestors, that feels like ancient ancestors, but many of our forebears um, started making their way to the United States as a result of these consistent pogroms and also the limited opportunities Jews had for economic success and for being able to live full and peaceful lives. Okay, before we get to the Dreyfus Affair, any questions or comments about this? I'm scrolling. Okay. Yes, Gordon. Gordon, you there? You can go ahead and unmute for me. Okay. Hang on to that question. And if you unmute and or feel free, and this goes for everyone, feel free to use the chat. Feel free to type your questions in the chat. It is one of the benefits of Zoom, although I wish we were in person, but that way folks can type down what they're wondering into the chat. What was happening in Eretz Israel? It's a good question. So at this point, Eretz Israel is, as it had been for the past 200 years, was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And so we see from demographic studies of the time that in that segment of the Ottoman Empire, within what was then called Palestine, you did have a mixture. You had generally a pretty small number of Jews. And of course, you had Muslims and Christians, and it was kind of a hodgepodge of them. But the Jews primarily living there had been there for many generations. I think many of us have met many Jews, um, you know, what we would describe as either Arab Jews or Middle Eastern Jews whose families date back in Jerusalem, specifically Jerusalem. Those were the main centers, both Jerusalem and Tzfat and Tiberias in the north. So that's kind of what's happening there. So fast forward a decade or so, and we get what many of us might have remembered, and probably one of the most famous cases of anti-Semitism in modern history, the Dreyfus Affair. So we have this guy, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, who is accused of spying for Germany. He's accused by the by the French military of spying for their German enemies over the course of the war. And this really sparks this larger conversation. And when we look at the way that the trial went, and I will admit I'm not an expert on kind of the intricate details, but we encounter um, what in America comes to be termed as dual loyalty. This question of, can Jews truly be either patriots? Like, can Jews truly be patriots? Can Jews truly be French? Can they truly be German? Can they truly be English? And it seems, and it is proved afterwards, that Dreyfus is singled out for these accusations because of his Jewish ancestry. And so this, like the pogroms that happen in Eastern Europe, really is a slap in the face to a lot of the Jews that were really excited about the opportunities brought by emancipation. Because what it said is that even though Jews are speaking the same language, going to the same schools, participating in the larger culture, the larger zeitgeist, to use a fancy German term, that they in some way or another are still seen as different or as dangerous or as not one of ours. And so the Dreyfus Affair is a really important moment for European Jews in general, but is specifically an extremely impactful event for an Austrian journalist who was covering the case at the time, a young man named Theodor Herzl. And so here we come to and so Gil Troy notes, for Herzl, this moment was a hammer blow, the howling of the mob outside the gates of the parade ground shouting, Again, not French speaker. Abat les Juifs, down with the Jews, fully transformed him, being Herzl, into a Zionist. So this is a hugely impactful moment. And of course, we began our first session talking about the title of our class, If You Will It, which is an ode to Herzl's, one of Herzl's very famous phrases from his writings. So let's take a look at Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl, born in 1860 in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Specifically, I believe he was born in Budapest, and eventually made his way, studied in the university in Vienna, which was really his first encounter with anti-Semitism. I think it is important to note that Herzl as an adult was very much a secular Jew. He was not affiliated religiously, if we wanted to use our terms for it, was not an actively practicing Jew, but in many ways felt, in that unique way, definitely felt connected to his Jewish heritage. And so after the Dreyfus Affair, he says, okay, this doesn't make any sense. We're not going to be accepted anywhere. The only way for Jews to continue to survive and thrive is for us to stake out a political sovereignty on our own. And so he writes in Der Judenstaat, or the Jewish state, we have honestly endeavored everywhere to merge ourselves into the social life of surrounding communities and to preserve the faith of our fathers. We are not permitted to do so. No human being is wealthy or powerful enough to transplant a nation from one habitat to another, and an idea alone can achieve that. And this idea of a state may have the requisite power to do so. The Jews have dreamt this kingly dream all through the long nights of their history. It is now a question of showing that the dream can be converted into a living reality. Let sovereignty be granted us over a portion of the globe large enough to satisfy the rightful requirements of a nation. The rest we shall manage ourselves. Now, of course, the one piece that's missing in there, and that is a part of the essay and was part of Herzl's belief, was that he believed that this state should be established in what he would have referred to as the land of Palestine, the ancient land of Israel. But I think it's important that for Herzl and for other folks that we're going to talk about here in a minute is seeing this establishment of the state. First of all, he's seeing anti-Semitism is primarily a political issue. It's born out of Jews not having a state of their own, and that he is seeing the hope and the dreams of returning to the land of Israel, which, as we talked about last week, was in so many ways like a mythic dream for Jews. Like, even though Jews for centuries had been praying towards Jerusalem, saying next year in Jerusalem at the Passover Seders, we don't see a large political movement to establish a state or a large immigration to the land of Israel until this time. And that's part of why I wanted to start our story in the modern world, even though, of course, we know Zionism is very much grounded and gains so much of its spiritual weight from those many centuries and millennia old dreams of returning to the land of Israel. But for him, this is not something to be waited until the Messiah comes or the age of redemption comes. This is something that we need right now. So this introduces us to our first flavor of Zionism, and I wanted to start with this because this is probably the most familiar to us. And this is the one that really, in so many ways, even though this is kind of the guiding force that leads to the state of Israel we have today. Jewish Virtual Library, Classics, Resource, Political Zionism stressed the importance of political action and to deem the attainment of political rights in Palestine a prerequisite for the fulfillment of the Zionist enterprise. Political Zionism is linked to the name of Theodor Herzl, we talked about, who considered the Jewish problem a political one. that should be solved by overt action in the international arena. His aim was to obtain a charter recognized by the world leadership, granting the Jews sovereignty in a Jewish-owned territory. In the Basel program, the result of the Zionist congresses drawn up in accordance with these principles, states that Zionism aims to establish a secure haven under public law for the Jewish people in the land of Israel. Okay, that was a lot of stuff. Talked a little bit about the beginnings of political Zionism, but it's important to note Herzl did not invent political Zionism. This was something that was in the ether, that was happening, that people were talking about, that he just eventually becomes the great champion of. But let's go ahead and pause for some comments and questions.
Rabbi, would only that the British had given us the Suez Canal instead of Palestine. We could have charged people to go through, and nobody would mess with us because everybody needs it.
Right, right. Yeah, that reminds me, there's the famous joke about when Moses crosses the Red Sea, wishing that he had made a right turn instead of a left turn, and then, that because that land is, filled, maybe not flowing with milk and honey, but certainly flowing with crude oil. But that's actually something we're going to talk about next week, which is, for many Zionists, it was not a foregone conclusion that this state would exist in the land, in the ancient land of Israel. There was something, and we're going to take a look at it next week, called the Uganda Proposition, that Jews would be given a section of the country of Uganda as kind of their home. But there were many people that were vehemently opposed to this, and so it is a question, and I think why I wanted to talk about how, for us, Zionism is seen as the singular thing, but there were many different types of Zionism that grew out of these many different circumstances, and so I think it's important for us to know that the many forms of Zionism that we see today, because even now in the state of Israel, there are different approaches to Zionism, that it's never been one singular thing, but it's actually a family of many different things. Yeah, Russell, go ahead.
Yes, I was surprised to know, because I'd always heard of Herzl and how great his influence was, that he only lived to be 44 years old. What happened that he died that young?
Yeah, that's a excellent point. He died in 1904. I believe he had pneumonia. And then a lot of the literature written about his life discusses how him having like a weak heart, and basically how he overworked himself, going through, going from political head of state to political head of state, battling against people from the outside. Honestly, he had to deal with a lot of people who weren't on board with his program within the Jewish community, within the Zionist Congress. So a little overworked. And, Herzl, for being such a monumental figure, I actually learned when I was putting this together that it was funny, the article said, even though he was a monumental figure, he stood at the grand height of 5'5". But he also dealt with personal struggles as well. I know his wife had mental health struggles, as well as his children. So personally, he had, unfortunately, a tragic life, but obviously was hugely influential in taking what was an idea and what was the topic of pamphlets and journals, and enacting it as a project, as a political project. Noor asks, what was the Basel program? I think that it's a general term for what the set goals of the various Zionist congresses, or the first being actually right here, in 1897. they took place in Basel, Switzerland, so that's why it's called the Basel program. But when they have these big congresses, I love to see all these guys in their nice white tie and their tails, looking very, dapper. It was kind of what the agreements from those debates ended up being. So before we move on, I want to mention, because as I said, just checking the chat here. It looks like the vision expressed here foresees a haven for Jewish persons within Palestine, but not necessarily as a nation exclusively for them. That's an interesting point there, Gordon. I would say most likely a nation exclusively for them, or at least a nation that was politically controlled by them. Now, it's different. Now, this is, again, when we get into the different visions of what Zionism looks like, we will encounter different positions as to what it means for the Jews to have a home in what was then referred to as the land of Palestine, or the ancient land of Israel. So you have, and of course, as people start moving there, as I note here, Dr. Leon Pinsker, really one of the founders of political Zionism, who wrote Auto-Emancipation, one of the foundational texts of Zionism in 1882, founded Chivat Zion, the lovers, or Chovevei Zion, the lovers of Zion, which with 10 members were one of the first groups of Jews from Eastern Europe to make their way into the land of Israel in 1882, and they founded Rishon LeZion up there in the north of Israel. But it was not a foregone conclusion that it would be a state solely run by Jews, but it depends on who you're looking at. And so the example that comes to mind is someone like Martin Buber, obviously well-known philosopher and theologian, and who, this is a little bit later. He made his way to the land of Israel, I think in the 1930s, fleeing kind of the persecutions from Nazi Germany. But he was a firm advocate in a binational state, in a state that comprised both of Arab Muslims and Jews, or Arabs and Jews is how they would refer to it. So there was a lot of conversation, and in just a moment we're going to take a look at some folks who actually were not huge fans of this movement to advocate for a state, to do what Herzl was doing, which was going to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, or going to the rulers of the British Empire, and all these people advocating for a state, but actually advocated for a different type of Zionism, a different return for Jews that wasn't necessarily pinned on Jews moving out of Europe into the land of Israel. So the other figure I wanted to make sure I mentioned here was Peres Smolenskin, who was a writer, an editor, and novelist, who founded one of the most pivotal journals in Eastern Europe, in the Russian Empire, called Hashachar, which means the morning or the dawn. And he was again one of these original conceivers of a political Zion, and he was I wanted to include this, fiercely opposed to the Jewish Enlightenment that was happening. We usually refer to that as Haskalah, which is kind of like the Jewish version of European Enlightenment. And he wrote, "In assuring us that as a reward for the Enlightenment, we would be able to establish our homes wherever we happen to be, they have told us to abandon all hope of returning to our own land and living there in dignity as all peoples do. Only a dog neither has nor wants a home. A man who chooses to live his whole life as a transient without a thought for the establishment of a permanent home for his children. I didn't include the last part of that phrase. I apologize, but the end of it says is no better than a dog. So pretty fierce language from Smolensk in there, but he was critical of this movement in largely coming out of Berlin and Germany, and largely wrapped up in Reform Judaism that sought to take away the national element of Judaism and solely present Judaism as a religion. And that was something we talked about last week as a different response to Enlightenment. And we looked at, there was a famous quote from a French noble and political actor who said, we will give Jews everything, all rights, all privileges of citizenship as individuals, but we will give them nothing as a nation. So the question of are Jews still considered within a nation, or are they just French nationals, English nationals, German nationals, with their own different religion, similar to how you could have French Catholics or French Protestants, English Catholics, some, I guess, or English Protestants, so on and so forth. So, and we talked a little bit last week. I realized this presentation is very European centric, but we did talk about last week about how in the United States it looked a lot different, and in many ways, certainly at this point in time, Reform Judaism becomes one of the dominant forces in the United States between 1850 and really up until this wave of immigration in the 1880s, and that, at least from an institutional perspective, Reform Judaism was very much opposed to this upsurge in political Zionism that they were seeing. And it was for that exact reason, for on the one hand, for fear of accusations of dual loyalty, for being seen as not un-American or loyal to a nation outside of the American nation, and also yeah, and there was a second part of that. I lost my train of thought. And also for, out of this commitment to patriotism, we looked at some stained glass windows that show Moses coming down from El Capitan in Yosemite Valley, bringing the 10 Commandments to the children of Israel. And we looked at, even some French Jews and German Jews talking about how France is my Zion, Paris is my Jerusalem, or a lot of language like that. But as we see, the forces of history and the way that things progressed after the beginnings of this Enlightenment period really changed things. And this is certainly the case when we get to the United States, and we'll talk about that a little bit next week. Okay, any other questions before we move on? Okay, checking the time. Okay, we're good. Here we have a picture of the first Zionist Congress. I believe there were 3 Zionist Congresses. Don't quote me on that. But these were, they gathered 200 delegates from all over many different countries, many different lands, and they all, debated over what the goals of Zionism were and how to implement them. So taking a look at those proceedings, there are many books and articles written about those. But let's take a look at our second flavor of Zionism. And of course, these are not necessarily mutually, they are distinctive, but all of these lead into the type of Zionism we see today. So we have cultural Zionism. Some people call it spiritual Zionism. And this was really created and developed by a figure who became known as Achad Ha'am, which means one of the people. His born name was Asher Tzvi Ginsburg. I think his pen name is a little bit better, rolls off the tongue nicer. And here we have, in contrast to the views of Theodor Herzl and political Zionism, in which Jewish statehood was advocated as a solution to the question of the Jews, Chad Ha'am saw the crux of the problem in the question of he saw the crux of the problem in the question of Judaism, which he believed had lost its spiritual assets, its sources of creative and national might. Chad Ha'am was one of the famous critics of Herzl, and particularly his fervent belief in solely political Zionism. But Chad Ha'am was not as dedicated to the notion of in order to be saved, Jews needed to move to Palestine, but rather that Palestine, or the ancient land of Israel, could become this cultural center that could renew and reinvigorate the national and spiritual and cultural life of the Jewish people as a way of mitigating against assimilation, the full, the fear of Jews becoming integrated into wider society and losing a connection with their ancient heritage. And that this center could radiate to all diaspora communities. And so the correct course of action, Chad Ha'am argued, is extensive and continuing educational activity among Jews and moderate settlement activity in Palestine. So very much more of a cultural revival, a cultural return to our language and our texts in a, not necessarily in the traditional Orthodox or religious way. At this point, saying orthodoxy, that's still kind of coming into being, but not in the traditional way, but in a way that enables Jews to participate in the larger cultural dynamics, but using their own language and their own unique kind of national gifts. Yes, thank you, Audrey. I know that there's been a book club of Daniel Gordis, A Concise History of Israel. And so if folks haven't checked that out, and I believe they're moving on to another book that will continues in our ongoing discussion of Zionism and Israel, and there will be another book club that Rabbi Jeff is leading. I'll send some details out about that. That will be focusing on Like Dreamers, which specifically hones in on the 1967 war. So cultural Zionism. So we have Chad Ha'am. He's really the one that we want to talk about. He writes in 1897, but a political ideal which does not rest on the national culture is apt to seduce us from our loyalty to spiritual greatness and to beget in us a tendency to find the path of glory in the attainment of material power and political dominion, thus breaking the thread that unites us with the past and undermining our historical basis. So Chad Ha'am was very wary of political power, or specifically political sovereignty in the way that Herzl was advocating, because he didn't want that to become kind of the thing that people might worship or spiritualize. Chad Ha'am, I think, in many ways, viewed political power as potentially a crutch or even a false idol, and in many ways sees a lot of power in the fact that Jews did not have political power for so long, which enabled them to kind of realize a certain level of spiritual achievement and cultural achievement that may not have been possible were they beholden to maintaining political power, in the same way that a lot of the other religious communities that existed in that time did. So this is kind of another stream that's happening here. And so you have the people that are really fixated on this notion of a state and advocating for the creation of a state, getting the various powers, whether it be the Ottomans, whether it be the British, whether it be the Germans, the French, to establish a state. Chad Ha'am much more focused on education and the spiritual enrichment of the people, and bolstering a spiritual power rather than a political power. So some other, oh, that's a typo. Cultural Zionism, other key figures. My apologies. These are some really important names to know. So Chaim Nachman Bialik, extremely important writer, and specifically as a poet. One of the first Hebrew poets that reached really kind of worldwide esteem, was a hugely influential in actually in the early origins of Tel Aviv, when Tel Aviv was first created in the early 1900s, around 1910 or so. We actually, if folks know the poem Hachama Merosh, the Sabbath Queen, we sing sometimes on Friday nights. It's still in our prayer book. That is actually his poem. We'll take a look at one of his poems, but he was part of this cultural outgrowth of, we want to revive the Hebrew language. We want to create poetry similar to the wonderful poetry that's coming out of France and Germany and England. And, we can think about the American poets that are, and philosophers and thinkers that are coming into their own at this time. Just because these are the things that I really nerd out about, I wanted to mention he has a really famous essay called Halacha and Agadah. Halacha means Jewish law. Agadah means Jewish folklore or legend. And it's a classic. It's a standard. It's great. Eliezer ben Yehuda, who was a linguist and a lexicographer, meaning someone who collected words, literally revived Hebrew as a spoken language. His household was the first fully Hebrew-speaking household in the land of Israel, or at least in, at least 2,000-3,000 years. He established the Academy of Hebrew Language, huge, giant. And these are the kinds of things I think it's important to note that didn't really concern people like Herzl or Smoleskin or Pinsker in terms of speaking Hebrew and engaging with traditional texts. I believe Herzl and his idea of the Jewish state would be that it would be an international state, and people would, for him, I believe, he believed people would speak Swiss or German or something like that, which was kind of like this international language. But for people like Ben Yehuda, people like Bialik, people like Achad Ha'am, you couldn't have a national revival without these core elements of our national heritage, like the language of Hebrew, like a secular study of Jewish traditional texts. So Bialik was also really famous for creating, in English it's called The Legends of the Jews, but basically what he did is he sifted through the Talmud and he took out all of the what's the word? All of the Agadah, all of the folklore from the Talmud, and basically pulled that out of all the legal argumentation and collected it into a huge compendium that was like one of the first books I had on my rabbinic bookshelf. And so to them, connecting with, and I would put the Hebrew Bible in there. A lot of Bialik's poetry, a lot of these early Hebrew poets' poetry is hearkening on biblical language. To them, that was what this national revival, what this Zionism was all about, was dipping into this wellspring of tradition in a way that was much more, they viewed, creative and life-giving than the traditional modes of Jewish learning, which really emphasized, particularly in Europe, in Hebrew we would call it pilpul, but like this really minute legalistic argumentation building from the Talmud. Wanted to include this excerpt, one of Bialik's most famous poems, or El Hatzipur in Hebrew. It's originally written in Hebrew. He writes, "Welcome back, lovely bird, from hot lands to my window. I died for your sweet song in winter after you left me at home. Sing of miracles far away. Is there, dear bird, tell me, much evil there too, and pain, in that land of warmth, of beauty? Do you sing greetings from fruited valley and hill? Has God pitied, comforted Zion, or she a graveyard still? Tears are done, hope is gone, but my torment has no end. Welcome back, precious bird, sing out your joyful song." So we see someone who, at that point, hadn't spent much time in the land of Israel, still connecting with it and dreaming of it. And this bird being seen as something returning from the land of Israel and hoping to sing of a more hopeful land, and potentially a more hopeful future. Oh, I did not realize that, Joshua. I did not realize that Mayim Bialik was related to the same family. That's good to know. Okay. Very interesting. We got all kinds of wonderful, wonderful education opportunities here happening in the Memphis Jewish community. So I'm really glad to hear that. Wanted to take a moment for any comments or questions. I know that's a lot. It's a lot of names I'm throwing at you, but the main takeaways are the impact of anti-Semitism. I think I put a nice little summary here. Impact
Rabbi?
of anti-Semitism, and then the two forms of Zionism that we see. And next week, we're going to be taking a look at some other flavors, because if you'll notice, a lot of the people we're talking about are not what we would refer to as religious Jews or religiously motivated Jews. So we're going to talk about religious Zionism, and then we're going to talk about labor and social Zionism, which is another really, really influential part of the DNA of kind of the modern state of Israel. And of course, we'll have some random thoughts.
Rabbi, it occurred to me that these people lived through some very turbulent times. With the end
That
of
they
the
did.
at
That
the
they
end of the
did.
the end of the American Civil War, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, World War II, the Great Depression. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and it's, when you think about kind of what's leading to these big movements and this huge shift, the quote I ended on last week talked about how Zionism, kind of in that umbrella term, was one, like, probably the most impactful ideology or ideological movement in modern Jewish history and it is very much a response to this kind of new and different world that they were living in, that was on the one hand exciting and on the one hand terrifying. It was exciting. There's all these advancements, there's philosophy, there's science, there's an industry and the Industrial Revolution, which is all happening kind of leading into this, but there's also these horrific ways of making war with industrial war. And there's a new type of hatred towards Jews that is framed differently than previous Jew hatred, in terms of blood libel and religious discrimination. So
It would have been terrifying to me to live in those times.
yeah, I would imagine if they could look ahead and see the times we live in, I wonder if they would say the same thing, to be honest with you.
Rabbi, can I just ask a quick question? Going back to the Ottoman Turks when they controlled Palestine, were Jews left alone, say in the 1800s, and specifically the second part of the 1800s? In other words, the Turks didn't discriminate, or there weren't any pogroms, right? They didn't go out killing Jews in Palestine, at least until World War One.
Yeah, I think that's something I want to bring in for next week, because that was a question last week. I just didn't have the opportunity to take a look. I think it's easy oftentimes to generalize, that, like Jews lived very easily in the Islamic world. And as with any question, same with Christian Europe, like it depends on when you look at. Certainly once Jews started arriving in mass in the
Sure.
1880s and early 1900s, there was a lot of conflict and violence.
Mm.
And there were definitely attacks on Jewish communities. And similarly, there were a lot of Jewish attacks as well. So it definitely led to, but that's something I can look into and bring for next week.
Okay.
Um,
Thank you.
oh, thank you, Audrey, for mentioning. I did want to make mention of Chemda Ben Yehuda, who was Eliezer Ben Yehuda's second wife, who was actually pivotal in creating the dictionary, the large lexicon of Hebrew of Hebrew terms and language. It is one of the unfortunate things that, when we learn this history, we don't hear as much about some of the pivotal women. But next week, when we're talking a little bit about how Zionism grew and came to be in America, we're going to talk about some really powerful women, specifically folks like Henrietta Jold, who was the founder of Hadassah. And we're going to talk about Emma Lazarus, and we're going to talk about some of the other folks. Unfortunately, kind of in the resources I was checking, I didn't see as many in the European sphere, or at least from this these origins. But that is a well taken point, and certainly a blind spot in my history. Any other thoughts or questions? I'm curious. I wanted to pose this question. If we're thinking about the 31 flavors, and we might go over time, and if people need to go, feel free. If they're thinking about the 31 flavors and the many different types of Zionism, to be fair, I've only presented 2. I'm curious about where people feel like they would incline towards. Whether it's kind of this political Zionism or the cultural Zionism. Now, of course, they work together. Even Achad Ha'am felt like, oh, well, the ancient land of Israel should still be this cultural hub. But I'm curious, like, as we begin to develop this menu of Zionisms, where folks kind of where you sit and where you feel your heart, like, where and you don't have to say anything here, but maybe something to think about is like, what do you feel like you would be drawn to? Because so much of this, and we'll talk about this next week, was people were in predicaments, were in challenging, tumultuous times, and they had to follow one of these many different isms. It's very well known that many Eastern European Jews who came to this country, when we learned American Jewish history with Dr. Zola and learning from Dr. Sarna, I remember Dr. Zola always said they all came with their isms. Whether it was Zionism, socialism, communism, whatever it was, they're all coming in with all of these larger intellectual movements that were happening in the wider world. And of course, those American Jews coming in with, we have our capitalism as well. Yeah.
I think it's political Zionism all the way. Jews have been a nation since the first kingdom of Israel and Judah. Jews have been a nation with or without Israel. So it's political Zionism because Israel is the home to Jews, whether they're secular, Orthodox, Reform. Any Jew should be able to claim Israel as his or her homeland. So for me, it's political all the way. That I think that far transcends cultural Zionism.
Spoken like a true Herzlian. Thank you for that. Noor.
My pleasure.
I feel like one can't really exist without the other, to be honest. 'Cause like when I realized that when you told me that like Herzl thought that, it should be like an international hub and didn't even think about the language aspect, I was like, what? Like, how, like, how do you think Jews from like Lebanon and Yemen and India would feel about speaking Swiss? It's like, what? Like, what?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point.
But like, also with cultural Zionism, like there were Jews living in the land even after like the exile, but like you can't, like, I understand not wanting to be caught up in being a political state, because I mean we've seen, I'm not going to get too much into modern day things, but we've seen what kind of people have gotten into the Israeli government, you know. And I can understand where people can take government power and just like worship that while losing the spirit, but it's like at the same time, like, you know, you can say, like, whenever Jews were practicing their heritage in the land and they were ruled by other people, there was always a but. Like, okay, you can be Jewish, but don't go this
Right.
far, you know. So I
Right.
feel like you do need some sort of political power, but you can't be like, oh yeah, we're just gonna speak Swiss and be an international, and you know that's gonna go. Like, I feel like one can't, you know, you can't do one without the other,
Yeah.
really, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that is also, I think it's important to know that that is one of the blind spots of a lot of these Zionist thinkers, a lot of these specifically European developers of modern day Zionism, which was, you know, thinking about a Jewish reality or the reality of what life is like for Jews outside of their European sphere. And that's very real in terms of, you know, they weren't thinking that much about it. It wasn't part of their scope. Yeah, Russell.
Just a little clarification on something that really is sort of on the side, but there is no language called Swiss. In Switzerland, they speak 4 different languages, and none of those are Swiss.
Thank you for that. I think I meant the Swiss. It's a Swiss dialect of German, correct?
Right.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And actually, Joshua notes that another Jew invented Esperanto, which sought to be a universal language, not related to any particular kind of like national or ethnic identity. It's actually a very interesting linguistic case in terms of trying to invent a language kind of from nothing. I will leave it to Joshua as an historian and more of an expert than I, but you know, this is it's a very tumultuous time, and we see that, of course, it's not, none of these solely on their own win out. It's not like political Zionism won out or cultural Zionism won out, but they all end up building up these different aspects that all culminate and not, I don't even want to say culminate in the establishment of the state of Israel, but lead to the establishment of the state and then the early history of the state of Israel and what that looks like. And in so many ways, we see these same ideas and these same different groups that in many ways seek the same thing, but have different visions for what that thing is. We see those different fault lines or that diversity, those many different flavors in Israel today. So, you know, it's not something that just happened way back when. It's something that is still very much alive and real in our times and in modern history. So thank you all so much for joining me. We'll come together next Thursday, 7 o'clock. Hope to see many of you in person. I'm hoping that all this will have melted by then. But if not, feel free to join on Zoom. And as always, please feel free to reach out.
I thought it was
Thank you, Rabbi.
Excellent.
No.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Silent.
Thank you very much.
Melvin.